All right, we're welcoming in Evan Lazar. We're talking about the Patriots. Not stuff going on the field, Evan. Nobody wants to talk about that right now. It's just all gloom and doom following a burn the tape loss to the Broncos this past weekend. We'll get into the 49ers, of course, throughout the week, but we're talking about the all-dynasty team, which is a thing nobody knew existed until very recently, but apparently the Patriots have one. They announced their all-dynasty team spanning a couple decades, and the timing of this you find a little bit curious.
Well, I think that what they're telling us, and maybe I'm looking too much into this, but it just sort of feels like they're saying, listen, the Brady era is over. That dynasty that we had with Tom Brady, we're closing the book on that. We're closing that chapter of the Patriots organization, and we're moving on. So this is sort of feels like, to me, like them saying the Brady era is done. The Brady era is closed. We're not talking about that anymore. This is something different. And even though the head coach is the same and some of the players that are on the dynasty team are still here, we're starting a whole different iteration. We want to completely separate ourselves from the Brady era.
Okay. Well, since people love debating pretty much everything, I guess let's just look at some of the names on the list and talk about a few omissions. And there's always going to be some here. And this is why people make lists in general, because they're fun to debate and kick around like, no, I would have had this guy. It seems to me right now, the one debate that everyone is having, it's centered around the receivers. Now, Randy Moss and Wes Welker are automatics, along with Julian Edelman and Troy Brown. Some people are wondering where Deon Branch was. Now, your thoughts here?
It's an interesting one. He wasn't even mentioned as an honorable mention.
Not an honorable mention. That was also Danny Amendola, right?
Right. So I don't know. It's hard to tell because, I don't know if anybody in football ops actually has a hand in this team, right? Is this all just Patriots.com putting this thing together and my friend Mike DeSalt and those guys, or is Belichick having any sort of input whatsoever?
Right.
So that's the sort of the question here. I think with Deon Branch, though, is that it probably was too short of a prime, and it wasn't quite a Randy Moss-like prime here where, yes, he had the big season in 2004 and the Super Bowl MVP, but it wasn't a record-breaking year for Deon Branch in 2004. So maybe it was just a little bit too short-lived, and you can't leave off Troy Brown or Julian Edelman off this list. So that's the things with lists like this. It's, okay, you want that guy on here, but who are you taking off? And I think that those four wide receivers are very deserving, and it's hard to take any of them off the list.
Yeah, the four are immovable. And I think anyone arguing against any of them isn't making a very good case. I mean, Wes Welker, arguably, I've seen some people theorize Welker might have been a little overrated, which is ludicrous. I think he redefined the slot position, or at least turned it from this cute little thing that you sometimes had into oh my goodness, this could be a real weapon in our offense. It revolutionized the way teams approach the game, realizing, oh my goodness, the middle of the field there, I can dominate that area with players like Wes Welker, who is as good at it as anybody we've seen since in terms of what he was able to do. I mean, just prolific. And Edelman, just in terms of what he's been able to do here inside and out in his versatility, I think, again, it's tough. Deon Branch, at the end of the day, even his best year, he didn't eclipse 1,000 yards receiving. I mean, it's a different era, but still, it felt like he was starting to ramp up his prime had he not sought that big deal and left when he did. It's possible he puts 2-3 more years here. You're having a different conversation. Instead, he goes on to Seattle, and that's that. So I think that one's fair. I'm going to look elsewhere on the offense. Only thing you can quibble with here, I mean, tight ends, Gronkowski, Graham, you get it. Graham was the 1.0 version of, he was really more of a inline blocking tight end and a really good one. Not nearly the pass catcher they expected when they drafted him or traded to draft him in the first round. I don't know if you make a case for Ben Watson there instead of Graham. I think that's probably the only place you could debate. Another spot possibly you could debate, Dan Copen sliding in as the center. I might make a case that David Andrews is a better all-around football player than Copen, but anything else stand out for you on the offense, either of those or any other position there?
I was going with center, David Andrews and Dan Copen. Look, I don't want to disrespect Dan Copen at all, but I think that we remember those beginning offensive lines, the early 2000s offensive lines, a little bit more fondly than maybe they actually were. Andrews, to me, not only, both of those guys were team leaders, but I think that Andrews is really the heartbeat of this Patriots team. And that interior three of Tooney, Andrews, and Mason, I think that that's the core and the identity of this Patriots roster right now. Yeah. That's their tone setters. That's their basis of their offense, is having those three rocks in the middle. So I think Andrews is a real pillar of Dynasty 2.0 in my mind, at least the recent Super Bowls that they've been to with Brady, obviously towards the end of his career here. I want to flip over to the defensive side of the ball if we can.
Let me give one more offense on that one. The only other offensive thing I wanted to talk about before we put a pin in that is, it is interesting to me that a team as dominant as the Patriots, having won 3 Super Bowls in each decade and having had terrific offenses in that span, if you look at the running backs, it is really interesting, because I don't know that you can argue necessarily for people to replace them, but you're looking at Corey Dillon, who had about a good season and a half here, maybe 2, and was dynamite in that first year. And then 2 third down backs rounding out the backfield with Kevin Falk and James White. And really, there's not much argument you can make to include anybody else. I'm a huge Danny Woodhead stan, but I can't argue in terms of production putting him in over those guys. I don't know where else you could go there. It's just amazing that that's really all they've got in the backfield there. Also speaks to the misses that they've had in the 2.0 version of things, having drafted Maroney and that not working out, and obviously now with Sony Michel. But the running back, you just look at it and you're like, that's a very underwhelming group, and also, but it's kind of probably the right choices.
Yeah, well, I don't know if a group with Corey Dillon and James White and Kevin Falk is underwhelming. I mean, it's not a great group. It's not, Eric Dickerson and Steven Jackson and Todd Gurley and like the Rams would have. But I think that if you look at that running back group, the one name that maybe you could make a case for is Antoine Smith. He was obviously
the early horse.
The early horse, right. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. So I could see that, but I don't have any real quibbles with the guys that they put there at running back. I love James Devlin, but I love how they just like slide the fullback in there too. Like, they don't necessarily need to have a fullback on these all dynasty teams. A lot of teams probably wouldn't have a fullback on their all dynasty team, but the Patriots gotta give James Devlin some love, so they slide that fullback position in there.
We'll switch to defense. I want to get your thoughts. It is interesting to me how heavy 1.0 that this defense is. You have Chung and McCourty and Gilmore in the defensive backfield. And outside of that, on the front 7, you only have Donta Hightower really sliding in there. I guess you can make cases. Ninkovich is kind of a later one there as well. So there's a little bit of crossover there, but it's a heavy slanted 1.0 dynasty defense.
Certainly. And the biggest sort of omission, I said, if you're going to take somebody off, you got to, if you're going to put somebody on, you got to take somebody off. I think Roman Pfeiffer over Jerod Mayo is
crazy.
A joke. And quite frankly, it's really ironic because Jerod Mayo is obviously
he's there.
Staff. So it's just to like when this team came out and then somebody showed this to Jerod Mayo and he saw Roman Pfeiffer in there over him, you got to think that he just started laughing, right? I mean, no disrespect to Roman Pfeiffer, but Jerod Mayo was definitely, I think, a better player. The one sort of argument I think you can have in that front 7 is Ty Warren versus Lauren Skye. I think that's a really good case for Lauren Skye. Same exact role, that 3-4 defensive end, primarily run stuffing interior lineman. I think Lauren Skye has been really good for them for the last couple of years, and you probably can make a case him versus Ty Warren, but they don't even have Lauren Skye as an honorable mention either. So I think that they really didn't have him on the radar. But to me, it's Roman Pfeiffer over Jerod Mayo. That one was a head scratcher.
Yeah, again, you can make cases, I guess, for Lawyer Malloy. Certainly in play there. I think with the guards, again, you're going back to the offense. It's really hard to argue against Mankins and Tooney, but I might have considered Mankins over Andruzzi. That one was a bit of a symbolic one there as well. I think Pfeiffer was the biggest one as far as I was concerned on the defensive side. Not much else you can really make a case for, I don't think. I think naming 2 long snappers is comical. You have one actual center and 2 long snappers is
Well, it's crazy because you got one kicker and one punter too. So the
Why two
disrespect
long snappers?
the disrespect to Steven Gostkowski, but the long snappers get two guys on there instead of the kickers. When the kicker Steven Gostkowski, who's the franchise leader in points, is not on this team,
right.
But they have Lonnie Paxton. Don't worry, he's on there. That's why I think that this is just like 0% to do with anybody in football operations. Like maybe they gave like a little text message to Ernie Adams and said like, hey, like, what do you think of this team? Because he's in on all the Patriots Hall of Fame voting and stuff like that. So maybe like he's the only guy I can think of in the building that's actually in football ops that might have had a say in this team.
Maybe. But you're right. If you're given two slots there, you got to give it to Gostkowski and Vinatieri, who are 1 and 1A in either direction. You could pick one and make a strong argument in either way. But those guys are about as even as you get. And if you're going to give a nod to two special teamers, I would say certainly do it there. And there was one other thing I wanted to point out. This one's pretty minor. But I would honestly argue that Jake Bailey currently is a better punter than anybody that they've had during the entire time. But again,
I was actually really surprised that I think Ryan Allen's performance in Super Bowl 53 alone is why he's on this Dynasty team right now.
Yeah.
And I get that, I guess. But they haven't, we could go back and look at all the punters that they've had in the Belichick.
Ken Walter,
Ken Walter or whatever. Jake Bailey's
famous for just out of the bunch. Being in the frame when you see the Vinatieri kicks. That's
right.
And Paxton's Snow Angels, they're iconic memories in our minds. But in terms of the players on the field, I'm not sure in those cases. But still, they're fun to talk about, fun to debate. Definitely a couple of interesting omissions there, and I do think the Deon Branch conversation people are having, there's just not a place for them. But we love Deon and everybody, and especially you're right.
Use the Deon Branch right now, that's for sure.
You think so warmly and fondly of those guys who brought you that first Super Bowl. You do, yes, you're right. You look at it, it's a little romantic. You remember them.
It's so true. It's nostalgia, and it's a lot of these players are very deserving to be on here. Willie, Vrabel, Seymour, obviously the guys in the secondary like Ty Law, Hall of Fame player, obviously deserves to be there. But I think there certainly is a little bit of nostalgia that plays in here that you don't want to have too much recency bias on the team, like a Dan Copen, like a Joe Andruzzi, like a Roman Pfeiffer. I think all those players are sort of in that category.
Yep. Agreed. All right. So we'll have more on the Patriots, obviously, throughout the week. We're heading into a matchup against the 49ers. Make sure you subscribe YouTube, Patriots Press Pass, exclusive Patriots content coming to you, and follow Evan Lazar on Twitter and read all of his written content on clnsmedia.com.